Cranford. By Elizabeth Cleghorn Gaskell. Chapter 11. Samuel Brown. The next morning I met Lady Glenmire and Miss Pole setting out on a long walk to find some old woman who was famous in the neighborhood for her skill in knitting woolen stockings. Miss Pole said to me, with a smile half kindly and half contemptuous upon her countenance, "I have been just telling Lady Glenmire of our poor friend Mrs. Forrester, and her terror of ghosts. It comes from living so much alone, and listening to the bugaboo stories of that Jenny of hers. She was so calm and so much above superstitious fears herself that I was almost ashamed to say how glad I had been of her Headingley Causeway proposition the night before, and turned off the conversation to something else. In the afternoon Miss Pole called on Miss Matty to tell her of the adventure, the real adventure they had met with on their morning's walk. They had been perplexed about the exact path which they were to take across the fields in order to find the knitting old woman, and had stopped to inquire at a little wayside public house, standing on the high road to London, about 3 miles from Cranford. The good woman had asked them to sit down and rest themselves while she fetched her husband, who could direct them better than she could, and, while they were sitting in the sanded parlor, a little girl came in. They thought that she belonged to the landlady, and began some trifling conversation with her, but, on Mrs. Roberts's return, she told them that the little thing was the only child of a couple who were staying in the house. And then she began a long story, out of which Lady Glenmire and Miss Pole could only gather 1 or 2 decided facts, which were that, about 6 weeks ago, a light spring cart had broken down just before their door, in which there were 2 men, 1 woman, and this child. One of the men was seriously hurt, no bones broken, only shaken, the landlady called it, but he had probably sustained some severe internal injury, for he had languished in their house ever since, attended by his wife, the mother of this little girl. Miss Pole had asked what he was, what he looked like. And Mrs. Roberts had made answer that he was not like a gentleman, nor yet like a common person. If it had not been that he and his wife were such decent, quiet people, she could almost have thought he was a mountebank, or something of that kind, for they had a great box in the cart, full of she did not know what. She had helped to unpack it, and take out their linen and clothes, when the other man, his twin brother, she believed he was, had gone off with the horse and cart. Miss Pole had begun to have her suspicions at this point, and expressed her idea that it was rather strange that the box and cart and horse and all should have disappeared, but good Mrs. Roberts seemed to have become quite indignant at Miss Pole's implied suggestion. In fact, Miss Pole said she was as angry as if Miss Pole had told her that she herself was a swindler. As the best way of convincing the ladies, she bethought her of begging them to see the wife, and, as Miss Pole said, there was no doubting the honest, worn, bronzed face of the woman, who at the first tender word from Lady Glenmire, burst into tears, which she was too weak to check until some word from the landlady made her swallow down her sobs, in order that she might testify to the Christian kindness shown by Mr. and Mrs. Roberts. Miss Pole came round with a swing to as vehement a belief in the sorrowful tale as she had been skeptical before, and, as a proof of this, her energy in the poor sufferer's behalf was nothing daunted when she found out that he, and no other, was our senior Benoni, to whom all Cranford had been attributing all manner of evil this 6 weeks past. Yes. His wife said his proper name was Samuel Brown, Sam, she called him, but to the last we preferred calling him the senior, it sounded so much better. The end of their conversation with the Signora Benoni was that it was agreed that he should be placed under medical advice, and for any expense incurred in procuring this Lady Glenmire promised to hold herself responsible, and had accordingly gone to Mr. Hoggins to beg him to ride over to the Rising Sun that very afternoon, and examine into the senior's real state, and, as Miss Pole said, if it was desirable to remove him to Cranford to be more immediately under Mr. Hoggins's eye, she would undertake to see for lodgings and arrange about the rent. Mrs. Roberts had been as kind as could be all throughout, but it was evident that their long residence there had been a slight inconvenience. Before Miss Pole left us, Miss Matty and I were as full of the morning's adventure as she was. We talked about it all the evening, turning it in every possible light, and we went to bed anxious for the morning, when we should surely hear from someone what Mr. Hoggins thought and recommended, for, as Miss Matty observed, though Mr. Hoggins did say, "Jack's up, a fig for his heels," and called preference, pref, she believed he was a very worthy man and a very clever surgeon. Indeed, we were rather proud of our doctor at Cranford, as a doctor. We often wished, when we heard of Queen Adelaide or the Duke of Wellington being ill, that they would send for Mr. Hoggins, but, on consideration, we were rather glad they did not, for, if we were ailing, what should we do if Mr. Hoggins had been appointed physician in ordinary to the royal family? As a surgeon we were proud of him, but as a man, or rather, I should say, as a gentleman, we could only shake our heads over his name and himself, and wished that he had read Lord Chesterfield's letters in the days when his manners were susceptible of improvement. Nevertheless, we all regarded his dictum in the senior's case as infallible, and when he said that with care and attention he might rally, we had no more fear for him. But, although we had no more fear, everybody did as much as if there was great cause for anxiety, as indeed there was until Mr. Hoggins took charge of him. Miss Pole looked out clean and comfortable, if homely, lodgings. Miss Matty sent the sedan chair for him, and Martha and I aired it well before it left Cranford by holding a warming pan full of red-hot coals in it, and then shutting it up close, smoke and all, until the time when he should get into it at the Rising Sunday. Lady Glenmire undertook the medical department under Mr. Hoggins's directions, and rummaged up all Mrs. Jameson's medicine glasses, and spoons, and bed-tables, in a free and easy way, that made Miss Matty feel a little anxious as to what that lady and Mr. Mulliner might say, if they knew. Mrs. Forrester made some of the bread jelly, for which she was so famous, to have ready as a refreshment in the lodgings when he should arrive. A present of this bread jelly was the highest mark of favor dear Mrs. Forrester could confer. Miss Pole had once asked her for the receipt, but she had met with a very decided rebuff. That lady told her that she could not part with it to any one during her life, and that after her death it was bequeathed, as her executors would find, to Miss Matty. What Miss Matty, or, as Mrs. Forrester called her, remembering the clause in her will and the dignity of the occasion, Miss Matilda Jenkins, might choose to do with the receipt when it came into her possession, whether to make it public, or to hand it down as an heirloom, she did not know, nor would she dictate. And a mould of this admirable, digestible, unique bread jelly was sent by Mrs. Forrester to our poor sick conjurer. Who says that the aristocracy are proud? Here was a lady by birth a Tyrrell, and descended from the great Sir Walter that shot King Rufus, and in whose veins ran the blood of him who murdered the little princes in the Tower, going every day to see what dainty dishes she could prepare for Samuel Brown, a mountebank. But, indeed, it was wonderful to see what kind feelings were called out by this poor man's coming amongst us. And also wonderful to see how the great Cranford panic, which had been occasioned by his first coming in his Turkish dress, melted away into thin air on his second coming, pale and feeble, and with his heavy, filmy eyes, that only brightened a very little when they fell upon the countenance of his faithful wife, or their pale and sorrowful little girl. Somehow we all forgot to be afraid. I dare say it was that finding out that he, who had first excited our love of the marvelous by his unprecedented arts, had not sufficient everyday gifts to manage a shying horse, made us feel as if we were ourselves again. Miss Pole came with her little basket at all hours of the evening, as if her lonely house and the unfrequented road to it had never been infested by that murderous gang. Mrs. Forrester said she thought that neither Jenny nor she need mind the headless lady who wept and wailed in Darkness Lane, for surely the power was never given to such beings to harm those who went about to try to do what little good was in their power, to which Jenny tremblingly assented, but the mistress's theory had little effect on the maid's practice until she had sewn 2 pieces of red flannel in the shape of a cross on her inner garment. I found Miss Matty covering her penny ball, the ball that she used to roll under her bed, with gay-colored worsted in rainbow stripes. "My dear," said she, "my heart is sad for that little careworn child. Although her father is a conjurer, she looks as if she had never had a good game of play in her life. I used to make very pretty balls in this way when I was a girl, and I thought I would try if I could not make this one smart and take it to Phoebe this afternoon." I think the gang must have left the neighborhood, for one does not hear any more of their violence and robbery now. We were all of us far too full of the senior's precarious state to talk either about robbers or ghosts. Indeed, Lady Glenmire said she never had heard of any actual robberies, except that two little boys had stolen some apples from Farmer Benson's orchard, and that some eggs had been missed on a market day off Widow Hayward's stall. But that was expecting too much of us. We could not acknowledge that we had only had this small foundation for all our panic. She grew so red while she was saying all this that I was not surprised at Miss Pole's manner of bridling up, and I am certain, if Lady Glenmire had not been her ladyship, we should have had a more emphatic contradiction than the, well, to be sure, and similar fragmentary ejaculations, which were all that she ventured upon in my lady's presence. But when she was gone, Miss Pole began a long congratulation to Miss Matty that so far they had escaped marriage, which she noticed always made people credulous to the last degree. Indeed, she thought it argued great natural credulity in a woman if she could not keep herself from being married, and in what Lady Glenmire had said about Mr. Hoggins's robbery we had a specimen of what people came to if they gave way to such a weakness. Evidently Lady Glenmire would swallow anything if she could believe the poor vamped-up story about a neck of mutton and a pussy with which he had tried to impose on Miss Pole. Only she had always been on her guard against believing too much of what men said. We were thankful, as Miss Pole desired us to be, that we had never been married, but I think, of the two, we were even more thankful that the robbers had left Cranford. At least I judged so from a speech of Miss Matty's that evening, as we sat over the fire, in which she evidently looked upon a husband as a great protector against thieves, burglars, and ghosts, and said that she did not think that she should dare to be always warning young people against matrimony, as Miss Pole did continually. To be sure, marriage was a risk, as she saw, now she had had some experience, but she remembered the time when she had looked forward to being married as much as any one. Not to any particular person, my dear, said she, hastily checking herself up, as if she were afraid of having admitted too much, only the old story, you know, of ladies always saying, when I marry, and gentlemen, if I marry. It was a joke spoken in rather a sad tone, and I doubt if either of us smiled, but I could not see Miss Matty's face by the flickering firelight. In a little while she continued. But, after all, I have not told you the truth. It is so long ago, and no one ever knew how much I thought of it at the time, unless, indeed, my dear mother guessed, but I may say that there was a time when I did not think I should have been only Miss Matty Jenkins all my life, for even if I did meet with anyone who wished to marry me now, and, as Miss Pole says, one is never too safe, I could not take him. I hope you would not take it too much to heart, but I could not take him, or any one but the person I once thought I should be married to. And he is dead and gone, and he never knew how it all came about that I said, no, when I had thought many and many a time, well, it's no matter what I thought. God ordains it all, and I am very happy, my dear. No one has such kind friends as I, continued she, taking my hand and holding it in hers. If I had never known of Mr. Holbrook, I could have said something in this pause, but as I had, I could not think of anything that would come in naturally, and so we both kept silence for a little time. My father once made us, she began, keep a diary, in 2 columns. On one side we were to put down in the morning what we thought would be the course and events of the coming day, and at night we were to put down on the other side what really had happened. It would be to some people rather a sad way of telling their lives. A tear dropped upon my hand at these words. I don't mean that mine has been sad, only so very different to what I expected. I remember, one winter's evening, sitting over our bedroom fire with Deborah, I remember it as if it were yesterday, and we were planning our future lives. Both of us were planning, though only she talked about it. She said she should like to marry an archdeacon, and write his charges, and you know, my dear, she never was married, and, for aught I know, she never spoke to an unmarried archdeacon in her life. I never was ambitious, nor could I have written charges, but I thought I could manage a house. My mother used to call me her right hand, and I was always so fond of little children. The shyest babies would stretch out their little arms to come to me. When I was a girl, I was half my leisure time nursing in the neighboring cottages, but I don't know how it was, when I grew sad and grave, which I did a year or two after this time. The little things drew back from me, and I am afraid I lost the knack, though I am just as fond of children as ever, and have a strange yearning at my heart whenever I see a mother with her baby in her arms. Nay, my dear, and by a sudden blaze which sprang up from a fall of the unstirred coals, I saw that her eyes were full of tears, gazing intently on some vision of what might have been. Do you know, I dream sometimes that I have a little child, always the same, a little girl of about 2 years old. She never grows older, though I have dreamt about her for many years. I don't think I ever dream of any words or sound she makes. She is very noiseless and still, but she comes to me when she is very sorry or very glad, and I have wakened with the clasp of her dear little arms round my neck. Only last night, perhaps because I had gone to sleep thinking of this ball for Phoebe, my little darling came in my dream, and put up her mouth to be kissed, just as I have seen real babies do to real mothers before going to bed. But all this is nonsense, dear. Only don't be frightened by Miss Pole from being married. I can fancy it may be a very happy state, and a little credulity helps one on through life very smoothly, better than always doubting and seeing difficulties and disagreeables in everything. If I had been inclined to be daunted from matrimony, it would not have been Miss Pole to do it, it would have been the lot of poor Signor Brunoni and his wife. And yet again, it was an encouragement to see how, through all their cares and sorrows, they thought of each other and not of themselves, and how keen were their joys, if they only passed through each other, or through the little Phoebe. The Signora told me, one day, a good deal about their lives up to this period. It began by my asking her whether Miss Pole's story of the twin brothers were true. It sounded so wonderful a likeness, that I should have had my doubts, if Miss Pole had not been unmarried. But the Signora, or, as we found out she preferred to be called, Mrs. Brown, said it was quite true, that her brother-in-law was by many taken for her husband, which was of great assistance to them in their profession, though, she continued, how people can mistake Thomas for the real Signor Brunoni, I can't conceive, but he says they do, so I suppose I must believe him. Not but what he is a very good man. I am sure I don't know how we should have paid our bill at the Rising Sun, but for the money he sends, but people must know very little about art if they can take him for my husband. Why, miss, in the ball trick, where my husband spreads his fingers wide, and throws out his little finger with quite an air and a grace, Thomas just clumps up his hand like a fist, and might have ever so many balls hidden in it. Besides, he has never been in India, and knows nothing of the proper sit of a turban. Have you been in India? Said I, rather astonished. Oh, yes. Many a year, ma'am. Sam was a sergeant in the 31st, and when the regiment was ordered to India, I drew a lot to go, and I was more thankful than I can tell, for it seemed as if it would only be a slow death to me to part from my husband. But, indeed, ma'am, if I had known all, I don't know whether I would not rather have died there and then than gone through what I have done since. To be sure, I've been able to comfort Sam, and to be with him, but, ma'am, I've lost 6 children, said she, looking up at me with those strange eyes that I've never noticed but in mothers of dead children, with a kind of wild look in them, as if seeking for what they never more might find. Yes. 6 children died off, like little buds nipped untimely, in that cruel India. I thought, as each died, I never could, I never would, love a child again, and when the next came, it had not only its own love, but the deeper love that came from the thoughts of its little dead brothers and sisters. And when Phoebe was coming, I said to my husband, Sam, when the child is born, and I am strong, I shall leave you. It will cut my heart cruel, but if this baby dies too, I shall go mad. The madness is in me now, but if you let me go down to Calcutta, carrying my baby step by step, it will, maybe, work itself off, and I will save, and I will hoard, and I will beg, and I will die, to get a passage home to England, where our baby may live. God bless him. He said I might go, and he saved up his pay, and I saved every pièce I could get for washing or any way, and when Phoebe came, and I grew strong again, I set off. It was very lonely, through the thick forests, dark again with their heavy trees, along by the river's side, but I had been brought up near the Avon in Warwickshire, so that flowing noise sounded like home. From station to station, from Indian village to village, I went along, carrying my child. I had seen one of the officers' ladies with a little picture, ma'am, done by a Catholic foreigner, ma'am, of the Virgin and the little Saviour, ma'am. She had him on her arm, and her form was softly curled round him, and their cheeks touched. Well, when I went to bid good-bye to this lady, for whom I had washed, she cried sadly, for she, too, had lost her children, but she had not another to save, like me, and I was bold enough to ask her would she give me that print. And she cried the more, and said her children were with that little blessed Jesus, and gave it me, and told me that she had heard it had been painted on the bottom of a cask, which made it have that round shape. And when my body was very weary, and my heart was sick, for there were times when I misdoubted if I could ever reach my home, and there were times when I thought of my husband, and one time when I thought my baby was dying, I took out that picture and looked at it, till I could have thought the mother spoke to me, and comforted me. And the natives were very kind. We could not understand one another, but they saw my baby on my breast, and they came out to me, and brought me rice and milk, and sometimes flowers. I have got some of the flowers dried. Then, the next morning, I was so tired, and they wanted me to stay with them, I could tell that, and tried to frighten me from going into the deep woods, which, indeed, looked very strange and dark, but it seemed to me as if death was following me to take my baby away from me, and as if I must go on, and I thought how God had cared for mothers ever since the world was made, and would care for me, so I bade them goodbye, and set off afresh. And once when my baby was ill, and both she and I needed rest, he led me to a place where I found a kind Englishman lived, right in the midst of the natives. And you reached Calcutta safely at last? Yes, safely. Oh. When I knew I had only 2 days' journey more before me, I could not help it, ma'am, it might be idolatry, I cannot tell, but I was near one of the native temples, and I went into it with my baby to thank God for his great mercy, for it seemed to me that where others had prayed before to their God, in their joy or in their agony, was of itself a sacred place. And I got as servant to an invalid lady, who grew quite fond of my baby aboard ship, and, in 2 years' time, Sam earned his discharge, and came home to me, and to our child. Then he had to fix on a trade, but he knew of none, and once upon a time, he had learned some tricks from an Indian juggler, so he set up conjuring, and it answered so well that he took Thomas to help him, as his man, you know, not as another conjurer, though Thomas has set it up now on his own hook. But it has been a great help to us that likeness between the twins, and made a good many tricks go off well that they made up together. And Thomas is a good brother, only he has not the fine carriage of my husband, so that I can't think how he can be taken for Signor Brunoni himself, as he says he is. Poor little Phoebe, said I, my thoughts going back to the baby she carried all those 100 miles. Ah! You may say so. I never thought I should have reared her, though, when she fell ill at Chundrabatted, but that good, kind Aga Jenkins took us in, which I believe was the very saving of her. Jenkins, said I. Yes, Jenkins. I shall think all people of that name are kind, for here is that nice old lady who comes every day to take Phoebe a walk. But an idea had flashed through my head, could the Aga Jenkins be the lost Peter? True, he was reported by many to be dead. But, equally true, some had said that he had arrived at the dignity of Great Lama of Thibet. Miss Mattie thought he was alive. I would make further inquiry. Chapter 12. Engaged to be married. Was the poor Peter of Cranford the Aga Jenkins of Chundrabatted, or was he not? As somebody says, that was the question. In my own home, whenever people had nothing else to do, they blamed me for want of discretion. Indiscretion was my bugbear fault. Everybody has a bugbear fault, a sort of standing characteristic, a piece de resistance for their friends to cut at, and in general they cut and come again. I was tired of being called indiscreet and incautious, and I determined for once to prove myself a model of prudence and wisdom. I would not even hint my suspicions respecting the Aga. I would collect evidence and carry it home to lay before my father, as the family friend of the two Miss Jenkinses. In my search after facts, I was often reminded of a description my father had once given of a ladies' committee that he had had to preside over. He said he could not help thinking of a passage in Dickens, which spoke of a chorus in which every man took the tune he knew best, and sang it to his own satisfaction. So, at this charitable committee, every lady took the subject uppermost in her mind, and talked about it to her own great contentment, but not much to the advancement of the subject they had met to discuss. But even that committee could have been nothing to the Cranford ladies when I attempted to gain some clear and definite information as to poor Peter's height, appearance, and when and where he was seen and heard of last. For instance, I remember asking Miss Pole, and I thought the question was very opportune, for I put it when I met her at a call at Mrs. Forrester's, and both the ladies had known Peter, and I imagined that they might refresh each other's memories. I asked Miss Pole what was the very last thing they had ever heard about him, and then she named the absurd report to which I have alluded, about his having been elected Great Lama of Thibet, and this was a signal for each lady to go off on her separate idea. Mrs. Forrester's start was made on the veiled prophet in Lalla Rookh, whether I thought he was meant for the Great Lama, though Peter was not so ugly, indeed rather handsome, if he had not been freckled. I was thankful to see her double upon Peter, but, in a moment, the delusive lady was off upon Roland's Calidore, and the merits of cosmetics and hair oils in general, and holding forth so fluently that I turned to listen to Miss Pole, who, through the llamas, the beasts of burden, had got to Peruvian bonds, and the share market, and her poor opinion of joint stock banks in general, and of that one in particular in which Miss Mattie's money was invested. In vain I put in, when was it, in what year was it that you heard that Mr. Peter was the Great Lama? They only joined issue to dispute whether llamas were carnivorous animals or not, in which dispute they were not quite on fair grounds, as Mrs. Forrester, after they had grown warm and cool again, acknowledged that she always confused carnivorous and graminivorous together, just as she did horizontal and perpendicular, but then she apologized for it very prettily, by saying that in her day the only use people made of four-syllabled words was to teach how they should be spelt. The only fact I gained from this conversation was that certainly Peter had last been heard of in India, or that neighborhood, and that this scanty intelligence of his whereabouts had reached Cranford in the year when Miss Pole had brought her Indian muslin gown, long since worn out. We washed it and mended it, and traced its decline and fall into a window blind before we could go on, and in a year when Woomwell came to Cranford, because Miss Mattie had wanted to see an elephant in order that she might the better imagine Peter riding on one, and had seen a boa constrictor too, which was more than she wished to imagine in her fancy pictures of Peter's locality. And in a year when Miss Jenkins had learned some piece of poetry off by heart, and used to say, at all the Cranford parties, how Peter was surveying mankind from China to Peru, which everybody had thought very grand, and rather appropriate, because India was between China and Peru, if you took care to turn the globe to the left instead of the right. I suppose all these inquiries of mine, and the consequent curiosity excited in the minds of my friends, made us blind and deaf to what was going on around us. It seemed to me as if the sun rose and shone, and as if the rain rained on Cranford, just as usual, and I did not notice any sign of the times that could be considered as a prognostic of any uncommon event, and, to the best of my belief, not only Miss Mattie and Mrs. Forrester, but even Miss Pole herself, whom we looked upon as a kind of prophetess, from the knack she had of foreseeing things before they came to pass, although she did not like to disturb her friends by telling them her foreknowledge. Even Miss Pole herself was breathless with astonishment when she came to tell us of the astounding piece of news. But I must recover myself. The contemplation of it, even at this distance of time, has taken away my breath and my grammar, and unless I subdue my emotion, my spelling will go too. We were sitting, Miss Mattie and I, much as usual, she in the blue chintz easy chair, with her back to the light, and her knitting in her hand, I reading aloud the St. James's Chronicle. A few minutes more, and we should have gone to make the little alterations in dress usual before calling time, 12 o'clock, in Cranford. I remember the scene and the date well. We had been talking of the senior's rapid recovery since the warmer weather had set in, and praising Mr. Hoggins's skill, and lamenting his want of refinement and manner. It seems a curious coincidence that this should have been our subject, but so it was, when a knock was heard, a caller's knock, 3 distinct taps, and we were flying, that is to say, Miss Matty could not walk very fast, having had a touch of rheumatism, to our rooms, to change cap and collars, when Miss Pole arrested us by calling out, as she came up the stairs, "Don't go, I can't wait, it is not 12, I know, but never mind your dress, I must speak to you." We did our best to look as if it was not we who had made the hurried movement, the sound of which she had heard, for, of course, we did not like to have it supposed that we had any old clothes that it was convenient to wear out in the sanctuary of home, as Miss Jenkins once prettily called the back parlor, where she was tying up preserves. So we threw our gentility with double force into our manners, and very genteel we were for 2 minutes while Miss Pole recovered breath, and excited our curiosity strongly by lifting up her hands in amazement, and bringing them down in silence, as if what she had to say was too big for words, and could only be expressed by pantomime. "What do you think, Miss Matty? What do you think? Lady Glenmire is to be married, I mean, Lady Glenmire, Mr. Hoggins. Mr. Hoggins is going to marry Lady Glenmire." "Marry," said we. "Marry. Madness." "Marry," said Miss Pole, with the decision that belonged to her character. I said marry. "As you do," and I also said, "What a fool my lady is going to make of herself." I could have said madness, but I controlled myself, for it was in a public shop that I heard of it. Where feminine delicacy is gone to, I don't know. You and I, Miss Matty, would have been ashamed to have known that our marriage was spoken of in a grocer's shop, in the hearing of shopmen. "But," said Miss Matty, sighing as one recovering from a blow, "perhaps it is not true. Perhaps we are doing her injustice." "No," said Miss Pole. "I have taken care to ascertain that. I went straight to Mrs. Fitzadam, to borrow a cookery book which I knew she had, and I introduced my congratulations a propos of the difficulty gentlemen must have in housekeeping, and Mrs. Fitzadam bridled up, and said that she believed it was true, though how and where I could have heard it she did not know. She said her brother and Lady Glenmire had come to an understanding at last. Understanding, such a coarse word. But my lady will have to come down to many a want of refinement. I have reason to believe Mr. Hoggins sups on bread and cheese and beer every night." "Marry," said Miss Matty once again. "Well, I never thought of it. 2 people that we know going to be married. It's coming very near. So near that my heart stopped beating when I heard of it, while you might have counted 12, said Miss Pole. "One does not know whose turn may come next. Here, in Cranford, poor Lady Glenmire might have thought herself safe," said Miss Matty, with a gentle pity in her tones. "Bah," said Miss Pole, with a toss of her head. "Don't you remember poor dear Captain Brown's song Tibby Fowler, and the line, 'Set her on the Tintock tap, the wind will blaw a man till her'? That was because Tibby Fowler was rich, I think. Well, there was a kind of attraction about Lady Glenmire that I, for one, should be ashamed to have. I put in my wonder. But how can she have fancied Mr. Hoggins? I am not surprised that Mr. Hoggins has liked her. Oh, I don't know. Mr. Hoggins is rich, and very pleasant looking, said Miss Matty, and very good-tempered and kind-hearted. She has married for an establishment, that's it. I suppose she takes the surgery with it, said Miss Pole, with a little dry laugh at her own joke. But, like many people who think they have made a severe and sarcastic speech, which yet is clever of its kind, she began to relax in her grimness from the moment when she made this allusion to the surgery, and we turned to speculate on the way in which Mrs. Jameson would receive the news. The person whom she had left in charge of her house to keep off followers from her maids to set up a follower of her own. And that follower a man whom Mrs. Jameson had tabooed as vulgar, and inadmissible to Cranford society, not merely on account of his name, but because of his voice, his complexion, his boots, smelling of the stable, and himself, smelling of drugs. Had he ever been to see Lady Glenmire at Mrs. Jameson's? Chloride of lime would not purify the house in its owner's estimation if he had. Or had their interviews been confined to the occasional meetings in the chamber of the poor sick conjurer, to whom, with all our sense of the mésalliance, we could not help allowing that they had both been exceedingly kind? And now it turned out that a servant of Mrs. Jameson's had been ill, and Mr. Hoggins had been attending her for some weeks. So the wolf had got into the fold, and now he was carrying off the shepherdess. What would Mrs. Jameson say? We looked into the darkness of futurity as a child gazes after a rocket up in the cloudy sky, full of wondering expectation of the rattle, the discharge, and the brilliant shower of sparks and light. Then we brought ourselves down to earth and the present time by questioning each other, being all equally ignorant, and all equally without the slightest data to build any conclusions upon, as to when it would take place. Where? How much a year Mr. Hoggins had? Whether she would drop her title? And how Martha and the other correct servants in Cranford would ever be brought to announce a married couple as Lady Glenmire and Mr. Hoggins? But would they be visited? Would Mrs. Jameson let us? Or must we choose between the Honourable Mrs. Jameson and the degraded Lady Glenmire? We all liked Lady Glenmire the best. She was bright, and kind, and sociable, and agreeable, and Mrs. Jameson was dull, and inert, and pompous, and tiresome. But we had acknowledged the sway of the latter so long, that it seemed like a kind of disloyalty now even to meditate disobedience to the prohibition we anticipated. Mrs. Forrester surprised us in our darned caps and patched collars, and we forgot all about them in our eagerness to see how she would bear the information, which we honorably left to Miss Pole, to impart, although, if we had been inclined to take unfair advantage, we might have rushed in ourselves, for she had a most out-of-place fit of coughing for 5 minutes after Mrs. Forrester entered the room. I shall never forget the imploring expression of her eyes, as she looked at us over her pocket handkerchief. They said, as plain as words could speak, "Don't let nature deprive me of the treasure which is mine, although for a time I can make no use of it." And we did not. Mrs. Forrester's surprise was equal to ours, and her sense of injury rather greater, because she had to feel for her order, and saw more fully than we could do how such conduct brought stains on the aristocracy. When she and Miss Pole left us we endeavored to subside into calmness, but Miss Matty was really upset by the intelligence she had heard. She reckoned it up, and it was more than 15 years since she had heard of any of her acquaintance going to be married, with the one exception of Miss Jessie Brown, and, as she said, it gave her quite a shock, and made her feel as if she could not think what would happen next. I don't know whether it is a fancy of mine, or a real fact, but I have noticed that, just after the announcement of an engagement in any set, the unmarried ladies in that set flutter out in an unusual gaiety and newness of dress, as much as to say, in a tacit and unconscious manner, "We also are spinsters." Miss Matty and Miss Pole talked and thought more about bonnets, gowns, caps, and shawls, during the fortnight that succeeded this call, than I had known them do for years before. But it might be the spring weather, for it was a warm and pleasant March, and merinos and beavers, and woolen materials of all sorts were but ungracious receptacles of the bright sun's glancing rays. It had not been Lady Glenmire's dress that had won Mr. Hoggins's heart, for she went about on her errands of kindness more shabby than ever. Although in the hurried glimpses I caught of her at church or elsewhere she appeared rather to shun meeting any of her friends, her face seemed to have almost something of the flush of youth in it. Her lips looked redder and more trembling full than in their old compressed state, and her eyes dwelt on all things with a lingering light, as if she was learning to love Cranford and its belongings. Mr. Hoggins looked broad and radiant, and creaked up the middle aisle at church in a brand new pair of top boots, an audible, as well as visible, sign of his purposed change of state, for the tradition went, that the boots he had worn till now were the identical pair in which he first set out on his rounds in Cranford 25 years ago, only they had been new-pieced, high and low, top and bottom, heel and sole, black leather and brown leather, more times than anyone could tell. None of the ladies in Cranford chose to sanction the marriage by congratulating either of the parties. We wished to ignore the whole affair until our liege lady, Mrs. Jameson, returned. Till she came back to give us our cue, we felt that it would be better to consider the engagement in the same light as the Queen of Spain's legs, facts which certainly existed, but the less said about the better. This restraint upon our tongues, for you see if we did not speak about it to any of the parties concerned, how could we get answers to the questions that we longed to ask, was beginning to be irksome, and our idea of the dignity of silence was paling before our curiosity, when another direction was given to our thoughts, by an announcement on the part of the principal shopkeeper of Cranford, who ranged the trades from grocer and cheesemonger to man-milliner, as occasion required, that the spring fashions were arrived, and would be exhibited on the following Tuesday at his rooms in High Street. Now Miss Matty had been only waiting for this before buying herself a new silk gown. I had offered, it is true, to send to Drumble for patterns, but she had rejected my proposal, gently implying that she had not forgotten her disappointment about the sea-green turban. I was thankful that I was on the spot now, to counteract the dazzling fascination of any yellow or scarlet silk. I must say a word or two here about myself. I have spoken of my father's old friendship for the Jenkins family. Indeed, I am not sure if there was not some distant relationship. He had willingly allowed me to remain all the winter at Cranford, in consideration of a letter which Miss Matty had written to him about the time of the panic, in which I suspect she had exaggerated my powers and my bravery as a defender of the house. But now that the days were longer and more cheerful, he was beginning to urge the necessity of my return, and I only delayed in a sort of odd forlorn hope that if I could obtain any clear information, I might make the account given by the Signora of the Aga Jenkins tally with that of poor Peter, his appearance and disappearance, which I had winnowed out of the conversation of Miss Pole and Mrs. Forrester.